Good afternoon, everyone. This is Troy Kilpatrick, the Executive Director at the Journey Museum and Learning Center. Thank you for coming and joining us today. Thanks to all the guests and all the members for all of your support. Today, the latest installment of our Journey discussions, Western Skies and Lakota Star Knowledge. This is actually the fourth presentation that has been put forward here this year by Megan Ostrenga, our on-staff person who's a science educator, extremely talented in a lot of other areas and fields. But Megan has done 3 other programs through the seasons. Throughout the calendar of the year, we've presented Western Skies and Lakota Star Knowledge. So today's is the 4th program, and we'll be packaging all 4 of those programs, making them available at journeymuseum.org. So a special shout out to Megan for all of her hard work to make sure that we've captured the appropriate ethnoastronomy, the cultural astronomy of our Native American communities, along with the scientific astronomy and science that we've been sharing here with all of you today. Also, it would be very appropriate for us to make sure that we say that we want to say thank you to the South Dakota Space Consortium for underwriting this package of programs so that we can make these journey discussions available at no charge to yourself and make the videos available at journeymuseum.org. The South Dakota Space Consortium, of which we are very proud to be an affiliate member, as we serve to try to inspire youth into STEM education, is also aligned obviously with NASA. So we're a NASA partner and we're excited to be partners and be a part of the South Dakota Space Consortium. Can never say thank you enough. So thank you to everyone at the South Dakota Space Consortium. So again, today, this is the 4th segment for Megan, and unfortunately at this point we're going to say goodbye to Megan, and she's going to be taking on her journey is going to take her elsewhere. And we wish her nothing but the best of luck as she moves forward, but we do want to make sure that everybody welcomes her warmly here today as we send her off on her last segment of Western Skies and Lakota Star Knowledge. Something I've shared before in the other programs, I'll get to do it one last time. This on behalf of Megan, who's a graduate of Texas Tech University. Let's all make sure that she wrecks them. Thank you, Megan. Thank you all.
Hello. How are we all doing today? Good. Well, thank y'all so much for stopping by. And as Troy introduced me, my name is Megan Ostrenga. I am the archivist curator here at the Journey Museum. And as he said, I am moving on. I'll be at the South Dakota State Archaeological Research Center starting in about a week. So I'm very excited to be moving over there. And so I'll continue doing work like this. So we will go ahead and get started with the program. And so firstly, we're going to start with what even is a constellation. How did we end up with these? And so originally, constellations were just pictures in the sky. And if we just think about us as humans, when we see something chaotic, we try to add order to that chaos. So it's the same thing with the stars. We just saw a bunch of dots. We wanted to be able to talk about what we're seeing up in the sky. And so we wanted to make pictures to tell people what part of the sky we're looking at. So to compare that, if you were to tell someone from a different country where you were today, you wouldn't just say I was in North America. That's pretty broad. You'd say I was in South Dakota. So you're breaking down the chaos of the land to tell them where you are. It's more specific, and then, oh, I know exactly where that is. It's the same thing with constellations. I'm not just looking up at the night sky, the northern hemisphere, I'm specifically looking at Sagittarius. And then everyone knows what you're talking about. However, what's kind of interesting with constellations is we came up with them before we knew anything about space. So at the time, we thought everything was a geocentric or Earth-centered universe. Like everything revolved around us here on Earth. And so the constellations, it was just when the star or the sun passed by this constellation that created the zodiac, which is called an ecliptic. And that's just, all of these are in that one line. It's all going around us in that space. However, we know that is incorrect. Now, we know we are a part of everything that's moving, but we've also learned that we're doing something called orbiting. In addition to orbiting, we are also rotating. And so this that we just looked at is a star trail, and that point all the way at the top here would be where the North Star is. And obviously that's not rotating, or we're not rotating, there's not going to be a trail there. But all of the other stars, as we're moving through the night sky, are leaving that nice trail there. And so, like I said, we're both rotating and we are orbiting around our star, which is the sun. And I had mentioned an ecliptic earlier, that was the zodiac. We have another ecliptic for all of our planets. And so the way that that works is on my piece of paper here. If I was to draw the sun and all of our planets on it, and then move my sheet of paper around, we don't have one just going off over here, right? They all move together. That's exactly what the ecliptic is. It's all of the planets moving together on their one plane. So that's just a little bit of info for you on how we are moving through space. And again, that's that plane right there. You can kind of see it's flat. Pluto is the weird one. And as we now know, all of the dwarf planets, they are doing whatever they want. But the planets are all on the ecliptic. And so now getting into some of the kind of more recent history, I suppose, of constellations. This is actually the Lascaux cave paintings in France. And these are 17,000 years old. And we think that this is probably one of the first depictions of a constellation. And, you know, looking at it, you're like, okay, I can tell that it's a bull, so it's Taurus the bull. But maybe, how do we know for sure that it's actually a constellation? So I'll let you kind of look at it here for a moment. And I promise it's in there. You can use the folks around you, try to see if you can see any of those constellations or any of the stars that make up Taurus. Is anyone feeling confident? All right. Did anyone get it right? No? Aw, come on. So I don't know about you, but this does not look like a bull to me. To me, it looks like a stick figure without a head laying on its side. So, you know, constellations require a lot of imagination. You kind of have to pretend a little bit, but then also, these are constellations that somebody else made up. You can have your own constellations, your own pictures. Whatever they look like to you, great. It's all, all science, all astronomy. And so, let's compare this back to the painting. And so we can kind of see some of these dots here in the face. And that makes that V. Now, that's maybe a stretch, but did any of you notice this before? Well, that is right above Taurus. And those are the Pleiades, which is an open cluster of stars. Open clusters, they have about 100 stars all in them, kind of gravitationally bound together. We know it as the Seven Sisters because we see it as 7 stars, but there's more in there. There's also something called a globular star cluster, and those have tens of thousands of stars in them, and those kind of look like, through a telescope, looks like a Q-tip or something. You kind of dabbed the lens of a telescope, and we have one up in the sky right now that's pretty cool. I'll talk about it later though. And so now moving into some of the constellations that are up in the sky tonight, we're going to talk about probably one of the most famous constellations, which is the Big Dipper, and that is in Vincent van Gogh's painting here. However, I'm sorry to say I'm going to kind of burst all of your bubbles. The Big Dipper is not a constellation. It is actually something that we call an asterism. And so an asterism is just a smaller grouping of stars. A constellation is a larger grouping of stars. So the Dipper is an asterism that actually makes up Ursa Major, which is the constellation. So the Dipper is just the back and the tail of this bear up here. But the whole constellation is the head, the legs, all the way down to the feet. And so this is kind of what that looks like. So again, constellation is the larger thing, asterism is a smaller grouping. And so now kind of showing you the whole night sky, we do have the Dipper here, and I always like to use the Dipper to cheat and find everything else because it's one, most commonly found in the North Hemisphere. It's pretty much always up wherever you're going to look in the night sky, so you can actually use it year-round. But then too, it's also some of the brightest stars in our night sky, so you can pretty easily pick it out. And so if you use the 2 stars here in that cup of the Dipper, they draw a straight line up to Polaris, which is our North Star. And that is the end of the handle of our Little Dipper. And another way I kind of like to find the two dippers is if you imagine there's water in the cup of our Little Dipper, it would be pouring into the cup of our Big Dipper. And in 6 months, everything will rotate. The Big Dipper will pour that water right back down into the Little Dipper. So there's always one pouring right back into the other. I guess unless they're side by side, but we won't talk about that for now. And then, like I said, we'll sometimes use the handle here. Well, I'll let you pretend that I didn't say that for right now. I want you to practice finding Polaris. It's pretty easy now that you've kind of seen it with lines, right? And so the next constellation we're going to talk about is Pleiades, and this is using the arc of the handle. And so using the arc, you will find the brightest star in Pleiades, which is here. And he is an ox herder, and he does have oxen that are in the sky as well as constellations, so he's constantly moving around Polaris, the North Star, constantly driving his oxen. And again, I don't know about you, but this doesn't look like a person to me. It looks like a kite with legs. But once you kind of imagine that, it makes it a little bit easier to find. And here again, I'll let you kind of see if you can find the dipper. It's in a different perspective than it was the first time. It's right here. Here's the cup. And then here is the arc of the handle. And we're going to use that arc to get to this star right here, which is called Arcturus. Get it? Arc to Arcturus. And then the kite, we come up here, and then this makes kind of that triangle top of the kite, here and back down. And then you can pretend the legs are whatever stars you want. And the arc continues on from Arcturus, and we spike to the star Spica to find Virgo. Virgo is actually more of a summer constellation up here. It's already kind of below the horizon by the time the sun sets, but in summertime it's one you can find. And I know some of us who are zodiac likers, Virgo is what's actually the zodiac right now, but why can't we see it? Seems weird, right? Well, the reason for that is because it's the zodiac when the sun passes through that constellation. It's not when you see it. And we'll talk about a few more of the zodiac constellations in a little bit, that are much later in the year, but yet we're seeing them in the sky. And again, it's because the sun needs to pass through them. But now moving on from Pleiades, we'll move on to Hercules. And so Hercules is associated with a lot of the constellations that we have in the night sky. In the spring, we'll see Pegasus come up. In the summer, we have Leo the lion, which is another one of the zodiacs. And the one that we have kind of year-round, because it's around the two dippers, is Draco the serpent. And the reason he's associated with so many of these is because he was half human, half god. And in order to become a god, he was sent on these 12 kind of missions to prove himself. And each one of them was supposed to teach him something. One of them was he had to kill Leo the lion. And Leo had impenetrable skin, so he had to get creative on how to actually kill the lion. This next story, like I said, of Draco, he needed to steal one of Hera's apples from her golden apple tree, which sounds really easy, but Draco was around this tree protecting the apples. And so Hercules, again, had to think about it, realized he needed to get rid of Draco. He killed him, and then he got one of the apples. And Hera, she was very sad about her serpent being killed, and so to remember her serpent, she put him up in the night sky. And he is one of the larger constellations that we have. His head is right here, and then it's this long serpent body here. And now just for reference for you, this is the Little Dipper again. And then this is Polaris. And I always kind of like to imagine here as well, like think about all of our medical symbols, right? It's always a serpent winding its way around a staff. You can kind of imagine that here, right? Draco is a serpent, and if you picture the staff as our North Star, he's kind of doing the same thing. So it's kind of similar imagery there. And then the Greek gods, they had some humor. So they put Hercules up here, and this is his body. This is a bow that he has. And, this is a leg, and his foot is conveniently stepping on the head of Draco. So kind of sending us back to those 12 missions that he had. And that star cluster I mentioned earlier with the tens of thousands, it's kind of just a little bit past this star. So if you find that star and you go a little bit to the left with a telescope, you'll find it. It's pretty cool to look at. And then moving into our true summer constellations, this is called the summer triangle. And so the summer triangle is the asterism. That's what's in red there. It's made up of the stars Vega, Deneb, and Altair, which are actually some of the brightest stars that we have here in the northern hemisphere. And then it's made up of 3 smaller constellations. And so the first one we'll talk about is this one all the way up at the top, which is Lyra, which is named for the lyre, the musical instrument. And my favorite object in space is actually in this constellation. So it's actually halfway between these 2 stars. And that is the Ring Nebula, which is one of the Messier objects. It's M57. And this is a planetary nebula. And even though the name says it's a planetary nebula, it actually has nothing to do with planets. It's actually a star at the end of its life. And so stars, they do a process called thermonuclear fusion, which is a big word for saying you take an element, you push it together, and you release heat and light. And stars eventually will run out of their element, and when they run out of their element, they run out of gravity. So then they start shedding their layers. And this star had a lot of different elements, and that's why there's so many different colors. I just think it's really pretty. That's why it's my favorite. But it's also a fun one through just like the average telescope. You don't need a spectacular one. It just looks like a blue Cheerio. It's pretty fun. So that's a very fun object. But while we're talking about fun space things, we'll talk about some current events as well. And this is the James Webb Telescope. It was launched actually, I think like a week before my first program here for the winter constellations. And so every update that I've had, I've been showing you kind of new things that have come back from this telescope. And so this was the first image that came back from the James Webb Telescope. And that was on, I think it was July 12th when it came back. And now this is a really cool image. And so I need to really go into some details so you really appreciate this image. So I want all of us to stick our arm all the way out. And now with your index finger and your thumb, I want you to pretend you're holding a grain of sand. Now looking at that grain of sand, that size in space is how big this image is. That's what it focused on. And this has thousands of galaxies in it. Every single one of those dots that you see in here is a galaxy. That's crazy, right? And all of these galaxies, this is even crazier, they are 4.6 billion light years away from us. So if you really want to do some math here, that light left those galaxies the year the Earth was formed. Right? I also kind of like to joke a little bit, right? Like, I'm sure somebody in this picture is also watching the same program as you, right? Like, there's no way they're not. So that's kind of funny. So that was the first image that came back, which is a pretty nice first image. And then this is the most recent image that I've gotten my hands on. This is from 10 days ago, and this is a stellar nursery. So this is where little baby stars are born every single day. And in this picture, they've already counted, I believe, 10,000 new stars that they didn't know about. So that's pretty cool. And so this nursery, its name is the Tarantula Nursery, or Tarantula Nebula. And that's because in normal telescopes before James Webb, it just looked like a wispy spider web, because it was just gray. We didn't see any of the other colors or any of the stars in there. So very cool that we now have all of this extra information from these pictures. But back to constellations. So that was all started because of Lyra. And then we'll come to this one right here. This is the constellation called Cygnus, and Cygnus is the swan. Some people also know it as the summer cross. And so the story with Cygnus is him and his friend Phaeton were chariot racers, and they weren't just normal chariot racers, they were like space chariot racers. And one day they accidentally flew too close to the sun, and they both kind of blew out of their chariots and fell back down to Earth. And Cygnus survived. Phaeton unfortunately landed in a river and was drowning. And Cygnus asked Zeus, is there any way that you can turn me into a swan so I can dive down and save my friend Phaeton? And Zeus was like, you know, swans don't live very long, right? And Cygnus was like, yeah, that is fine. I just want to be able to save him. Zeus was like, all right. And so he became a swan. He dove down, saved his friend happily ever after until he lived his short swan life. And so Zeus was moved by how humble that Cygnus was, and so he put his remains up in the sky to remember, or help people remember that you always want to help out your friends. And so that's Cygnus. Again, it's a little arbitrary, but each one of these is one of the wings, and then this would be the head and the neck with the short tail out to Deneb, the brightest star. And then the last of the summer triangle constellations is right here. And I've heard it pronounced a couple of different ways. I've heard Aquila and Aquila. I'm not quite sure which one is the true one, but he was the eagle that carried lightning bolts for Zeus. And I feel like there should be some cool stories to go along with that job, but I haven't found one yet. So if any of you have heard one of those stories, let me know. I would love to learn about it. So those are the three that are the summer constellations. And something I actually learned today is the southern hemisphere actually sees the triangle too. They just call it the winter triangle because they just see it the opposite time. So I didn't realize that one, because not all of the constellations make it all the way around, but this one actually, this set of three does, which is pretty cool. And so we'll just kind of move now into the fall constellations, which is a little tricky about how far north we are, is that a lot of the true fall constellations are only up for about an hour, kind of right at sunset, and then they kind of sink below our horizon. And so the two true fall constellations are Scorpio and Sagittarius. And this was an image I kind of tried pulling, and it was, I think, maybe like 7 p.m. tonight, like this is where they should be. And you can see the black line here on the bottom is where our horizon line is, and then they are not going to get any higher. So this is kind of the best week for these two constellations that we're going to get here. And so talking about Scorpio, he is associated with the constellation Orion. And so the story with Orion is that he was a very cocky individual, and he was always telling people, I can defeat any beast on Earth. And Mother Earth did not like that very much. So she sent out the scorpion, and the scorpion took down Orion. So, that kind of reminds people that we need to be a little more humble. And what's pretty cool, in my opinion, about their placement in the sky is when Scorpio is in the sky, Orion is exactly 180 degrees away. So when one is rising, the other one is setting. So you will never see both of them at the same time. And I know that's kind of a misconception a lot of folks have is, I don't know why I can't see Orion tonight. Well, if you can see Scorpio, you're not going to see Orion. And so Orion will be one that we see a lot in springtime. It's just slightly different that we will see it more in the nighttime than we do with Scorpio, but they are always rotating opposite, which is pretty cool. And then the other one, Sagittarius, he is a centaur, a half human and a half horse. What's pretty cool about his placement is with his bow and arrow, he's pointed directly at the bright star in Scorpio, which is called Antares. And so it's like he's pointing at the heart of the scorpion, because the placement of that star is pretty much kind of the heart or the head of the scorpion. And Antares is actually a really funny name for a star. So if you can kind of see in this image, it's a little bit more red than all of the other stars that are around it. And so a lot of folks think that that's Mars. I mean, Mars is red, makes sense, right? The name Antares literally translates to mean not Mars. So they got us with that one, right? And then the other really cool thing I think about Sagittarius is you can kind of see, again, this is the creativity, right here, like the body of like a teapot. Here's the spout, here's the lid, and then here's the handle of a teapot. And if you imagine that it's a teapot, if you can kind of see this blur right here, that is the Milky Way. And so the Milky Way is like the steam rising out of your teapot. So it's a cool way to kind of find both of them. And it's cool to think that, wow, we're really seeing like the arm of our own galaxy when you see that kind of dusty blur. So that's pretty cool. And so now you might be able to see some of the lines here a little bit better without the pictures. We're just going to go through and review some of these, maybe build up your confidence for looking at them tonight. And then we'll start talking about the Lakota constellations. So this is kind of an overview of everything that's in our sky tonight. The ground would be about here. I guess here, depending on when the sun sets. So we've got Ursa Major, our big bear, Ursa Minor, our little baby bear, and Draco is weaving his way around. We have Hercules stepping on his head. He is upside down right now. We have our summer triangle over here. And then way in the corner we have Sagittarius and we have Scorpio. So I'll turn off those drawings, kind of let you see just the stars. It's looking a little easier, right, to recognize they look a little more like shapes now. And now I want you to kind of practice finding them. Is anyone feeling a little better? Good. All right, and so now we'll move into the Lakota constellations. And what I really want to emphasize with our Lakota constellations is that they very much believe in the concept of mirroring. And so what is in the sky, what is in the stars, is reflected and mirrored exactly on the land in the Black Hills. And so I will show a couple of clips from Craig Howe. He works at Cairns, and he is kind of the ethnoastronomy expert, if I can humble him with that. And he will show and share some of the stories as well.
This idea that we are related to all the parts of the universe is very important in the Lakota way of thinking. But at the time of our ancestors, life was a lot more difficult. And the margin for error was small. So one way Lakotas mitigated this unpredictability of the environment was to establish relationships with all of these living entities. So they would make essentially like treaties with the cottonwood trees or with the geese or with the grasses in the rocks. They would have all these relationships that were established with all these other oyates or peoples. All of those entities were seen as living and as relatives to the Lakotas. And that's the way the Lakota world was structured, with all these things we see on this world, and also with the stars and all of the things in the sky as well.
And so this is a Lakota hide map of the Black Hills. And the first part that we'll talk about is this circle that goes around all of the Black Hills. And this is called the racetrack. And so their story of the Great Race is that it was between all of the two-leggeds and all of the four-leggeds to determine who had dominion over who. So who could eat who. And this race was 4 laps around the entire Black Hills. And so all of the animals, they set off on this race. And as you can imagine, this is a very long race. And 4 laps, after a while, they're starting to wear the soles of their feet just down, and they're starting to leave a trail of blood behind them, staining the rocks. And like I had said, this was a really long race, and throughout the race, the magpie was getting tired. And so he decided to fly on and ride on the horns of the buffalo. And the buffalo at this point was leading the race. And just about before the buffalo crossed the finish line, the magpie flew on ahead and won the race for the 2-leggeds. And that is why we get to eat the animals, as opposed to them eating us. And so Lakotas very much revere the magpie. It's a sacred bird for them. And they also honor the buffalo because it helped the magpie out as well. And as I had said, they stained the rocks red with how long this race was. And you can see this hoop going all the way around all of the Black Hills here. And it's kind of a reddish color. And this is called the Spearfish Formation. You'll get to see it in the geology portion of the museum as well. And then mirroring in the stars, this is more of a winter constellation, is the hoop, but you can see it on both the spring side and the fall side. So that's why we're kind of talking about it now. And so the hoop encompasses a lot of major stars here. These are the heads of Gemini, just kind of letting you guys know where we are. These are the Pleiades with Taurus the bull again. This is where Orion is. So it kind of encompasses a large portion of our sky. And so then moving over to the things that don't really set a whole lot is we have our Dipper, and they don't have the rest of Ursa Major. They only use the Dipper. And so we'll listen to a little video about the importance of the Dipper.
From a Lakota viewpoint, when an individual is born, they are given a spirit, a wanahi, from a star. And then they live their whole life with that wanahi, with that spirit. And then when they die on this earth, that spirit leaves. And it goes into the cup of the Big Dipper. The 4 stars then carry that spirit to the Milky Way. And those 4 stars are called the carriers. Sometimes they're seen as individuals carrying a blanket with a spirit between them, and sometimes, Biko mentions this, they are horses that are carrying the spirit to the Milky Way. Now, the Big Dipper has 7 stars. The other 3 stars in the handle are the mourners. So 4 carriers and 3 mourners accompany the spirit to the Milky Way. In Lakota, the Milky Way is called the Wanahi Tachanku, the spirit trail.
So we have the carriers, which is the cup, and then the mourners, which is the handle. So again, we have our hoop, which represents all of us, and then the next, the carriers and the mourners. And then we'll talk about this right here. It's kind of like a little arc. It's a part of Leo the Lion in the Western constellations, but for Lakotas, it's the Osheti, or the Fireplace. And the Fireplace is used in their sweat lodges, so they can release spirits and they can spend time with kind of the physical vessel for their holy breath. And so they'll use the Fireplace to heat up rocks, and then they'll pour water on the really hot rocks to create steam. And then that is where they're spending time. And so this is symbolizing the important fireplace for their ceremony. And then continuing to move, you can see how we have the Dipper and the Fireplace. We're moving into, we have the Thunderbird next, and then the Salamander will come next. But talking about the Thunderbird next, the Thunderbird is a very sacred animal for the Lakotas, and they said that the Thunderbird used to live on top of the Pahasapa, which means the Black Hills. And depending on who you speak to, they may or may not say that the Thunderbird still lives in the Black Hills or he does not. And the reason that he may not anymore is, as we know, the Black Hills or the Pahasap is a very sacred land for Lakotas. Us as tourists, we're never supposed to be coming here to come visit, take our vacations here. And so for that reason, they think maybe the Thunderbird has left, which again is totally understandable knowing how sacred the land is for Lakotas. So the Thunderbird is a constellation to remind them of how sacred everything is. And then moving into the salamander, which I mentioned first, and then we'll talk about the turtle as well. They both are important for Lakota children. And when a baby is born, when the umbilical cord falls off, they save it. And they save it in these amulets. And they call them their chikpas or the chekpas. And they save it because they want to preserve that original connection. And they kind of say if you don't preserve your baby's umbilical cord, they're always going to be searching for this connection, and that's why you might have a restless baby. You didn't save that umbilical cord. And they have two different ones. The salamander is for boys, the turtle is for girls. And so the reason for that is a boy will receive a salamander because if you think about salamanders, they can lose their tail, right? And so they're saying boys, it symbolizes them growing up. They'll grow up with their family, and then eventually once they're an adult, they'll lose their first family and they'll start a new family. But like a salamander, they're going to remain strong between that transition. And so that is what the salamander represents. And then the turtle represents steadfastness and having a nice long life and being supportive. And so those are the two amulets that are given for the chikpas. And so the salamander is definitely like a summer constellation. It is up in the middle of summer. The turtle is just barely starting to rise now. So it'll be a later in the fall constellation. And then at the very end of fall, getting into winter, as you can see, we're back to the hoop over here on this side, are the last two. And so the top one is the elk, and this kind of triangle one is the dried willow. And both of these constellations, as well as the turtle and the salamander, they're all a part of the Lakota ecliptic. So do you remember that word from before? Right? The zodiac is when the sun passes through that constellation. These are all what the Lakotas used as their kind of zodiac version. And the elk, there are a lot of different stories about how elk are important to Lakotas, but none of them necessarily relate to the constellation itself. But the dried willow, right here, it actually relates to ceremonies done by Lakotas. And so that hoop, which I said corresponds to all of the Black Hills, they'll use that to determine when they need to be and where they need to be for their ceremonies. So one example being this right here is the constellation called Matotipila, and it correlates to Matotipila, the landmark, which is Devil's Tower, and that is where they do their sun dances in the summer. And so when the sun passes through Matotipila, they go to Matotipila. And when the sun passes through dried willow, it's actually the opposite part of the year. That is when they are in their winter camps. And so this one is actually, like I said, the sun passes through it at the spring equinox. So not for a while, but the constellation itself is up in the fall. So that is the last of those constellations. So we'll just kind of review again, looking at some of the line drawings. Like I said, this is one side of the hoop. And then this was dried willow and elk. Here was the turtle and the salamander. And then this is, we jumped across the hoop, now we're on the other side. Here's the Osheti and the dipper. So I'll let you kind of practice seeing some of those now. Bet you didn't expect that, right? All right. And I just want to leave y'all on kind of one last note from Craig as to why it is important for us to continue all of these Lakota star stories, and we continue sharing them after we look at these constellations.
What we know about Lakota star knowledge is based on centuries of observations by Lakotas. Lakota homelands are perfect places to observe the stars. The Lakota peoples of the past were astute observers and critical thinkers. This exploration of traditional narratives and historical events is based on a deep reverence for Lakota star knowledge. By studying this star knowledge, we can get a glimpse into the integrated and sophisticated structure of Lakota philosophy. And it's this unique philosophy that connects the world when we and Hanwi travel together with the world of the students at Spring Creek. When Ella Deloria wrote her book, Speaking of Indians, in the 1940s, she drew on a number of sources in Lakota communities to help her to understand the past, what she called the ancient ways. So she says that these men were Christian men, mature leaders in the community at that time. And she said they had no wish for the outgrowth of the ancient way. But she then says they would tell her about that ancient way for hours on end. And she described that as they would do so with tender reverence. This idea that they were telling about the beliefs of their forefathers, and that they didn't believe it, but they gave it the respect it deserved because their forefathers believed it. These star stories would fit entirely within that realm of literature that we should show tender reverence to. Whether we believe it or not is not important. This is what Lakota ancestors believed. This is what they were telling their children. And if we want to understand Lakotas at that time, and then the connection between that time and today, then we need to study these, not as fairy tales, but as great literature.
And then just leaving you with one last image, this is a map that includes both the Western and the Lakota constellations. And it's kind of hard to see, but behind the brightly colored, there's the peach colored constellations. Those are the Western ones all year long. And then the very brightly colored constellations are all of the Lakota constellations. And you can see how it corresponds to each of the seasons. You're welcome to come up here and look at it a little bit closer if you'd like. And that is the end of the program as far as I have. And if y'all have any questions, you're welcome to ask them. So thank you very much for coming by today.
Thank you.